Imagine a princess, born into a world of impossible splendor, a world of gilded halls, shimmering silks, and gardens so vast they seemed to touch the horizon. She was the firstborn daughter of the most powerful king and queen in Europe, destined for a life of privilege beyond comprehension. But what if that golden cradle was not a blessing, but a target? What if fate had marked this child not for a crown, but for a series of tragedies so profound they would shatter her world before she even had a chance to understand it? This is the story of Marie Thérèse of France, the girl they called Madame Royale. She was born with the hope of a nation resting on her tiny shoulders. But before she would celebrate her 15th birthday, she would endure 4 devastating losses, each one chipping away at her childhood, her family, and her very identity. This wasn't just a life of misfortune. To those who watched it unfold, it felt like a curse. Our story begins not with darkness, but with dazzling light. On December 19th, 1778, the Palace of Versailles erupted in celebration. After 8 long years of marriage, King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette finally had a child, a daughter, Marie Thérèse Charlotte. The bells of Paris rang out and cannons fired in salute. She was a symbol of stability, the future of the Bourbon dynasty. From her first breath, she lived within a bubble of perfection. Her days were a carefully orchestrated ballet of lessons, music, and walks through the immaculate palace grounds. She had a private governess, servants who attended to her every need, and parents who, despite their royal duties, doted on her. Her mother, Marie Antoinette, created a fantasy world for her children at the Petit Trianon, a rustic retreat on the Versailles estate. It was a place of laughter, simple games, and genuine affection, a stark contrast to the rigid formality of the royal court. Marie Thérèse was a serious child, observant and intelligent. She learned the weight of her title, Madame Royale, early on, but she was still a child, a sister. Soon, she was joined by 2 brothers, Louis Joseph and Louis Charles, and a baby sister, Sophie. The royal family was complete, a picture of domestic happiness, seemingly untouchable within their fortress of gold and marble. But outside the palace gates, a storm was gathering. The whispers of discontent in the streets of Paris were growing louder. But inside, the children were shielded from the harsh realities of a kingdom on the edge. For young Marie Thérèse, the first crack in her perfect world had nothing to do with politics or revolution. It was a private, intimate sorrow. Her baby sister, Sophie, was a fragile child. Born in 1786, she was never strong. Just before her first birthday, she succumbed to illness. For an 8-year-old girl, death is a confusing, terrifying concept. One day, her sister was there, a tiny presence in the nursery, and the next, she was gone. The palace mourned, of course, but it was a quiet, contained grief. This was the first tragedy, a deep, personal loss that taught the young princess a painful lesson, that even within the safest walls in the world, life was fragile. Love could be taken away in an instant. It was the first shadow to fall across her sunlit childhood, a hint that her perfect world was not as secure as it seemed. But it was only the beginning. The second tragedy was of a different scale entirely. It wasn't just a loss for the family, it was a crisis for the nation. Marie Thérèse's eldest brother, Louis Joseph, was the Dauphin, the heir to the throne of France. From the moment of his birth, he was the center of the kingdom's hopes. He was bright, kind, and adored by his family, But like his little sister Sophie, he was plagued by poor health. By the spring of 1789, it was clear that the 7-year-old Dauphin was not going to recover. His illness had twisted his young body, and he was in constant pain. The family watched, helpless, as the future king faded before their eyes. Marie Thérèse, now 10 years old, had to witness the slow, agonizing decline of her beloved brother. She saw the profound grief etched on her parents' faces, a grief that all the power and wealth in the world could not soothe. On June 4th, 1789, Louis Joseph died. The court went into deep mourning. The heir was gone. His title passed to his younger, healthier brother, 4-year-old Louis Charles. But the death of the Dauphin sent a tremor through the monarchy. It felt like a terrible omen. And this time, the family's private sorrow was completely overshadowed by the public storm that had finally broken. While the royal family was consumed with grief for their lost son, the French Revolution was igniting. Just a little over a month after the prince's death, the Bastille was stormed. The anger of the people, simmering for years, had finally boiled over. For Marie Thérèse, the world was turning upside down. She had just lost her brother, and now the very foundations of her life were cracking. The sounds of celebration for the revolution were to her sounds of terror. The world outside was no longer a distant murmur, it was a roar, and it was getting closer. This was the second tragedy. The death of the heir, a devastating blow that left the family vulnerable at the exact moment the kingdom began to crumble. She had lost her sister, then her brother. Next, she would lose her home. The autumn of 1789 was tense and fearful. The royal family remained isolated in Versailles, but they were no longer masters of their own destiny. They were becoming prisoners of the revolution. The third tragedy was not a single event, but a terrifying, protracted ordeal that stripped away the last remnants of the princess's childhood. On the morning of October 5th, a massive crowd of women from Paris, furious over the price of bread and fueled by revolutionary fervor, began to march on Versailles. They walked for miles, armed with kitchen knives, pikes, and whatever they could find. They were coming for the king and queen. Imagine being 10 years old, locked inside a palace that was supposed to be the safest place on earth, and hearing the screams of a furious mob at your gates. Marie Thérèse and her family huddled together as the crowd breached the palace defenses. They heard the sounds of fighting, the shattering of glass, and the terrifying chants demanding the death of her mother, Marie Antoinette. Guards were killed just outside the queen's chambers. The family barely escaped, gathering in the king's apartments, listening as the palace itself was overrun. The next day, the royal family was forced to surrender. The crowd demanded they leave Versailles and move to Paris, to be under the watchful eye of the people. They were escorted from their home by the very mob that had terrorized them. The 10-year-old princess, her younger brother, and her parents were placed in a carriage and began a slow, humiliating journey to the capital, surrounded by a jeering crowd. They would never see their magnificent home again. Their new residence was the Tuileries Palace in the heart of Paris. It was still a palace, but it felt like a cage. The sprawling freedom of Versailles was replaced by confinement. They were constantly watched. Guards patrolled their halls. Their every move was scrutinized. The laughter and innocence of their lives at the Petit Trianon were a distant memory. This was the third tragedy, the loss of home, freedom, and safety. Marie Thérèse went from being a princess in a palace to a prisoner in a gilded cage. The world she had known, the only world she had ever known, had been violently torn away. She was now living in the heart of the revolution, a hostile city that saw her family not as its rulers, but as its enemies. The weight of fear became a constant companion. She had to grow up fast, learning to hide her terror behind a mask of royal composure. She had lost her siblings, she had lost her home, and now the revolution was coming for her parents. The years in the Tuileries were a slow, grinding descent. There was a desperate failed attempt to escape in 1791, which only sealed their fate. After they were caught, any remaining trust between the monarchy and the people was destroyed. The family was moved from their palace prison to a true prison, the grim medieval Temple Tower. Here, all pretense of royalty was stripped away. They lived in a few small rooms, under constant surveillance. The lavish meals were gone, replaced by simple rations. The army of servants vanished. The family, once the symbol of France, was now reduced to 4 people clinging to each other in a cold stone tower. The king, the queen, Marie Thérèse, and her little brother, Louis Charles. In this bleak setting, Marie Thérèse turned 14. Her birthday was not marked with balls or extravagant gifts, but with the quiet dread of what was to come. Her father, once the absolute monarch of France, was put on trial by the revolutionaries. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. He was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. This brings us to the 4th tragedy, the one that would forever define her life. On the evening of January 20th, 1793, just a month after her 14th birthday, King Louis XVI was allowed one final visit with his family. Imagine that scene. The heavy door to their rooms creaks open, and their father stands there, knowing he will be dead in a matter of hours. The family collapses into his arms, their cries echoing in the small chamber. There are no words for a moment like that. The king tried to be brave. He sat his children down and made them promise 2 things: to forgive his enemies and to never seek revenge. He gave them his final blessing. Marie Thérèse clung to her father, overcome with a grief so immense it was physical. This was her papa, the man who had taught her, played with her, and loved her. And now he was being taken from them to be publicly executed like a common criminal. The farewell lasted for nearly 2 hours, a vortex of tears and whispered goodbyes. Then he had to go. He promised he would see them one more time in the morning, but it was a promise he knew he couldn't keep. It was too cruel, too painful to say goodbye all over again. The next morning, the 14-year-old princess and her family listened from their tower. They heard the drums rolling through the streets of Paris. They heard the clamor of the crowds. And then, at a little after 10 in the morning, they heard the distant roar that signaled the fall of the guillotine's blade. Her father was gone. This was the 4th tragedy, the brutal public execution of her father. For Marie Thérèse, it was the ultimate devastation. It was the loss of a parent, the destruction of her family, and the end of the world as she knew it. She had lost a sister to illness, a brother to disease, a home to the mob, and now a father to the revolution. All before her 15th birthday. The curse, it seemed, was not yet finished. She would go on to lose her mother, Marie Antoinette, to the same fate 9 months later. Then she would endure the horrific ordeal of hearing her little brother, the boy king Louis XVII, being abused and slowly broken in the cell below her until he too was gone. Marie Thérèse would be the sole survivor of her immediate family, a lonely orphan left to carry the weight of their memory. She would spend 2 more years alone in that tower, a silent witness to the destruction of her entire world. The girl who was born to be the jewel of France had been plunged into its darkest abyss. 4 tragedies, 4 unhealable wounds inflicted on a child before she even had the chance to become a woman. Was it a curse, or was it simply the cruel, indiscriminate hand of history? perhaps there's no difference. For the young princess trapped in the temple tower, the gilded dream of Versailles had become an unending nightmare. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that behind the grand tapestries of history, behind the crowns and the thrones, are real people, and sometimes even children, who are forced to pay the highest price for the tides of change. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more untold history.